You're holding a newborn. It's yours. And something is different. Maybe a limb that didn't form the way it should have. Maybe eyes that can't see. Maybe a body that moves differently than the others. Maybe something you can't name, but can feel the moment you hold them. And you are standing in a world with no hospitals, no specialists, no government support, no charity, no system of any kind built to help this child survive. Just you, your group, the cold, and a baby that the world was not designed for.
What happens next? For most of human history, the assumption has been brutal and simple. A child born different in the ancient world didn't survive. The group couldn't afford it. Evolution wouldn't allow it. Nature would take its course, and that would be the end.
That assumption is wrong, and the evidence that proves it wrong is some of the most quietly extraordinary archaeology ever found. Because scattered across the ancient world in caves and burial sites and sediment layers hundreds of thousands of years old, researchers keep finding the same thing. Children and adults who were born different, who should not have survived by any cold calculation, who lived anyway, who were cared for, who were loved. Let's start with what different actually looked like in the ancient world, because the range was as wide then as it is now. Archaeologists have found ancient remains showing individuals born with conditions we would recognize today. Skeletal evidence of what appears to be Down syndrome dating back thousands of years. Children with spina bifida who survived well past infancy. Individuals with severe limb differences who lived into adulthood. A child in medieval Denmark with a condition that would have made walking painful and difficult from birth, buried with obvious care, and grave goods suggesting they were valued. A young person in ancient China with a condition affecting the entire left side of their body, who lived for years, clearly supported by others. These are not isolated finds. They keep appearing. Every continent, every era, every kind of ancient society that has left bones behind. Someone born different. Someone who survived longer than they should have if the world was purely brutal. Someone who was buried with care when they finally died. The bones tell the story that the history books forgot to. Now, let's talk about what the group actually faced when a child was born different, because the decision was never simple, and the people making it were not monsters or saints. They were just people, under enormous pressure, trying to keep everyone alive. The first thing the group would have assessed is function, not in a cold clinical way, but in the practical, urgent way of people who depended on each other completely. Could this child eventually contribute in some way? A child born blind in a hunter-gatherer group could not hunt large game, but they could process food, they could tend a fire, they could care for younger children, they could make tools by touch, they could hold the group's stories and songs in memory better than anyone because they had learned to carry everything in their mind. A child born with a limb difference might not run at full speed, but human groups needed more than runners. They needed thinkers, planners, healers, storytellers, people who stayed at camp and kept things running while others were out. Contribution in the ancient world was not one-dimensional, and the group understood this in ways that narrow economic thinking does not. The second thing the group assessed was relationship. Who did this child belong to? A child born to a high-status hunter, a respected elder, a woman whose skills were essential to the group. That child started with a weight of social connection behind them that changed how the group responded. This was not fairness, it was reality. Human groups have always mixed care with politics. The child of someone beloved was more likely to be given the chance to prove themselves. The child of someone marginal was in a harder position from the beginning.
But here is what the evidence keeps showing. Even children who had no obvious future utility, even children whose conditions would have required significant long-term care, were kept, were fed, were carried when they could not walk, were buried with tenderness when they died. In Portugal, archaeologists found the grave of a child who had a severe physical condition from birth. The child lived to around 10 years old, an age that would have been impossible without years of deliberate, sustained care in a world where basic survival consumed most of the group's energy. The grave contained ochre, shells, and small, carefully selected objects. Someone spent years keeping this child alive, and when the child died, someone spent time making sure they did not go into the ground alone. At a site in Spain, researchers found the remains of a young individual with craniosynostosis, a condition where the bones of the skull fuse too early, affecting the shape of the head and in many cases cognitive development. This individual survived to young adulthood. They did not survive by accident. They survived because people around them chose, repeatedly and over many years, to make sure they did. This is the part that gets overlooked in every conversation about ancient life. The cost of caring for a child who needed extra support was not invisible to the group. They felt it. The food given to a child who could not yet gather their own was food that came from someone else's effort. The time spent carrying a child who could not keep up was time taken from other tasks. Ancient humans were not naive about scarcity. They understood exactly what care cost, and they paid it anyway. Why? The cynical answer is kin selection. The biological drive to protect those who share your genes, even at cost to yourself. A parent will exhaust themselves for their child, because that child carries their genetic future. This is real, and it is ancient, and it is still running in every parent alive today. But the evidence suggests something beyond pure biology was happening, because many of the individuals who received long-term care in the ancient world were not the biological children of the people most likely caring for them. They were group members, tribe. The child born different was not just a parent's problem. They were everyone's responsibility, absorbed by the group the way the group absorbed everything difficult.
Anthropologist Kim Sterelny has written about how human groups developed what he calls niche construction, the deliberate reshaping of the environment to make it work for the group rather than simply accepting what the environment offers. A child who could not walk well was a problem the environment posed. The group's answer was not to discard the child. It was to reshape how the group moved, where it camped, what roles were valued, what contribution looked like. This is one of the things that made humans different from almost every other species. We did not just adapt to our environment, we adapted our environment to us, including the social environment. We built a world inside the group where a child born different could find a place. That said, it would not be honest to pretend the ancient world was uniformly compassionate. It was not. There is evidence of infanticide in ancient populations, the practice of not keeping a newborn who was too different, too costly, or born at the wrong time, during a famine, during a migration, in a season when the group had nothing to spare, was real. It was not unique to ancient humans. It has appeared across human cultures throughout recorded history and into the modern era. The ancient world was not sentimental about survival when survival was genuinely at stake. But here is what the evidence shows most clearly. Infanticide was a last resort, not a default. The default was care. The default was finding a way. The default was the group surrounding a new life and deciding together to try. And the children who were kept, the ones who survived into childhood and beyond, often became something the group did not expect. They became essential in ways that the group could not have predicted at birth. The child who could not run became the one who stayed at camp and kept the fire. The child who could not hunt became the one who remembered every plant, every season, every path. The child who moved differently became the one who sat still long enough to notice what everyone else walked past.
Difference, it turned out, was not always a liability. Sometimes it was the thing the group didn't know it needed. Anthropologists who study neurodiversity in evolutionary context have argued that conditions we now categorize as disabilities may have carried genuine advantages in certain ancient contexts. A person whose brain worked differently might have been the one to see patterns no one else saw, to hold a kind of focus or memory or creativity that the group could not replicate. The ancient world didn't have a word for autism or ADHD or any of the conditions on the modern spectrum, but it had people whose minds worked that way, and some of those people almost certainly changed what their group was capable of. There is also this. The act of caring for someone who cannot fully care for themselves does something to a group. It builds something. The people who kept a different child alive were not only saving a life, they were practicing the skills that made large-scale human cooperation possible: patience, empathy, the ability to see someone's value beyond their immediate utility, the understanding that a group is stronger when it protects its most vulnerable, not because protection is efficient, but because it is what makes a group worth belonging to. Every civilization that has ever lasted was built on some version of that understanding, and it did not begin with civilization. It began in the dirt, around a fire, when someone decided that a child who arrived differently was still worth keeping. You are here
Because somewhere in your line, someone made that decision, maybe many times. A child who should not have survived by any cold calculation, a group that looked at the cost and decided to pay it anyway. That decision is older than language, older than tools. It may be one of the oldest things about us, and it is still the thing that tells you, more than anything else, what kind of people we actually are.